Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. The Buddha's teachings were always intended to be practical, to provide a path of practice for beings to find their way to liberation. So he was not interested in providing philosophical or metaphysical theories, teachings of that sort. There is, for example, a list of 10 questions that the Buddha said couldn't be answered, or he wouldn't answer. They probably make up a pre-existing kind of a questionnaire amongst the wanderers and philosophers, yogis in ancient India, to sort of peg each other in their belief systems. So he was asked on a number of occasions these 10 questions. Is the world finite? Is the world infinite? Is the world endless in time, or is it bounded in time? Is the jiva the same as the body? Is the body different from the jiva? And jiva is another term somewhat analogous to Atman, meaning a soul or an essence of a person. It's particularly used by the Jains, but also by others. They call it like the life essence. And then the fourfold dilemma about the nature of a Tathagata after death. Does the Tathagata exist after death? Does the Tathagata not exist after death? Does the Tathagata both exist and not exist? Or does the Tathagata neither exist nor not exist? So all of these 10 questions the Buddha would refuse to answer. He would say, I have not declared, when he was asked, is the world finite? He would say, I have not declared the world is finite. Is the world infinite? I have not declared the world is infinite. It seems that of these 10 questions, the reasons for the Buddha's non-answer, the Buddha's silence, is different in the case of different questions. In one sutta dealing with right speech, the Buddha talks about the ways of answering questions. And it's kind of an interesting perspective in that it's a sort of glimpse into the use of logic or dialectics in ancient India in the Buddhist context. The Buddha said that there are 4 kinds of questions, and each requires a different kind of answer. There are straightforward questions that can be answered straightforwardly. There are questions that can only be answered with qualification. So you would say, like, in this case, yes, but in other case, no. There are questions that can only be answered with a counter question. Essentially something like, what do you mean by that? Or, ask someone to clarify or define their terms before you can answer. And the 4th kind of question is so ill-formed and based on faulty premises that it can't be answered at all. And I think this is the case with the questions about whether the jiva is the same as the body or not. From perspective of the Buddhist not-self doctrine, It would be like a question if someone asks, does the unicorn in your backyard eat dandelions or does it eat clover? It's a question of defining terms about a non-existent entity, so it's a meaningless question. It's ill-formed. It assumes in the question, it assumes that a jiva exists. And it's similar with the 4 points of the question about the Tathagata after death, which correspond to the 4 points of the Indian logical system. So any question that had a meaningful answer should fall into one of those 4 points, but the Buddha refused to answer them. In the case of the wanderer Vacchagotta, who occurs in a number of suttas as being a kind of a mixed up fellow, kind of confused mind, who would ask the Buddha questions and end up being befuddled. He asked the Buddha those 4 points. At each one, the Buddha said, that does not fit the case. And in the end, Vacchagotta says, well, how can that be? How can none of them fit the case? The Buddha gives the analogy of the fire. They're apparently sitting beside a campfire while he's talking. And the Buddha said, if the fire were to go out, and someone were to ask you, where's the fire gone? Has it gone to the north? You would have to say, no, that doesn't fit the case. Has it gone to the east, to the west, to the south? No, it doesn't fit the case. So none of these 4 points of the quadrilemma fits the case. It's not correct to say that the Tathagata exists or doesn't exist or neither or both. In another sutta dealing with the same 4 points, Sariputta makes the interesting observation or argument that only one who does not correctly understand the 5 aggregates would even ask that question. He goes through the aggregates. He says one who does not understand form would ask this question. One who does not understand feelings and so forth. And then a variation to that sutta, this is in the Samyutta, so there's a number of short suttas that are all variations of each other. And the variation to that is only one who has craving towards form, who has craving towards feeling, perception, etc., would ask that question. So it's a question that's ill-formed because it's based on a misperception of reality to begin with. In another case, which again involves Vacchagotta, the wanderer, he asks the Buddha if the self exists or not, and the Buddha refrains from giving him an answer. And Ananda asks him after, why didn't you tell him that the self does not exist? And the Buddha said that if I told him the self exists, that would be wrong and lead him into wrong view. If I told him the self did not exist, he wouldn't understand that. He would only grow fearful that he will be annihilated, and he'll end up being more confused than he was before. So sometimes the Buddha could refrain from giving a teaching based on the circumstance of the listener. As the Buddha said in one discourse, he said, which is greater, the leaves in the forest or the leaves in my hand, holding up a handful of leaves? And the monk said, well, the leaves in the forest are much greater. And the Buddha said, the leaves in the forest represent all that I know, but all that I need to teach for liberation of beings are represented by the leaves in my hand. On the other hand, he also said that he taught with an open hand, not with the closed fist of a teacher, meaning that he had no secret doctrines, no esoteric teaching. Everything that he taught was open. When we look at the first two of those questions, is the world finite or infinite and in space and time? Well, it makes up a set of four questions. The main reason that I think he didn't answer them was because it's not a speculation that's conducive to liberation. There's the analogy, the parable that occurs in one sutta of the man struck by an arrow. And the physician offers to remove the arrow. And the man says, yes, you can remove the arrow, but first I want to determine what wood the shaft of the arrow was made from, what bird the feathers came from, and whether the man who made the arrow, whether he was tall or short, whether he was fair-haired or dark-haired, how old he was, what city he came from. If by the time he got the answer to all these questions, he would be dead. And the point is to get the arrow out. And he gives this parable directly in relation to this kind of speculation. This puts Buddhism in kind of a unique position among major religious traditions. It's often, for example, thought that one of the tasks of a religion is to provide a myth or a story of creation or of the origin of things. And just about every tradition has some kind of version of that. Whereas Buddhism particularly says that's not a concern. You're not going to be able to discover the ultimate origin of things. Related to that, there's a set of four areas of speculation that are to be avoided because they can only lead to frustration or even madness. One is to ponder the range of a Buddha's mind. One is to ponder the range of mind of a person in jhana. And one is to ponder the intricacies of karma. And the last is to ponder the nature of the world. And the commentary relates that directly to the origin of the world. And it has a kind of a odd phrase. It says, he wonders who created the mountains, who created the sea, who created coconuts, mangoes, and palmyras. So, even though the Buddha was quite explicit in enjoining his disciples not to speculate about these kind of things, nevertheless they did. And as soon as the commentaries, in the commentary to the Abhidhamma, we have a definitive statement that there are four things which are infinite in number. One is the knowledge of a Buddha, one is space, one is the number of beings in the universe, and the other is the number of world systems in the universe. So there's already a definitive statement that the world is infinite. This is in quite clear opposition to the Buddhist statement that it cannot be known. There also is a strong tendency in the later texts to make the assumption that the origin of the world is not only unknown or not to be speculated, but that there actually is no origin, that it's beginningless, which is a position that, at least in terms of logical consistency, stands with the rest of the Buddhist teachings. It makes sense in that one of the philosophical underpinnings of Buddhism is the idea of causality, the universality of cause and effect. And if there is an ultimate origin of things, there would have to be, at the beginning point, there would have to be a first origination. There would have to be a causeless cause, the prime mover. To use terms from Western philosophy, I think from Aristotle originally, the primo mobile, the first mover. Whereas this doesn't make any sense in Buddhist philosophy, that there could be anything without a cause. So the only way out of that is to see time as infinite in both directions. So this became established position later, that the universe is infinite both in space and in time. But it's certainly not, that wasn't the original intention of the Buddha, and he was, pretty definitive that, such speculations are not conducive to getting the arrow out. Likewise, with the range of the mind of a Buddha, again, the later generations had to play with that concept as well. The Buddha never, for himself, never explicitly claimed omniscience, to be all-knowing. And there are incidents, particularly in the Vinaya, that would seem to indicate quite clearly that he was not omniscient. For example, he would lay down a rule for the monks and then found that in practice it caused difficulties, so he would then modify the rule. An example is the rule about not eating in the afternoon. At first there were no exceptions, but some monks would become weak and tired in the afternoon, so he said, I allow all monks the 5 tonics: honey, ghee, sugar, oil, and nawanitang. So if he was an omniscient being, he would have formulated the rule that way in the first place. This is the argument. But whenever there's any such cases arise, the commentators always do some clever maneuvers to show that actually he did know, but he wanted to make a point or something. But it seems like the plain reading is that the Buddha did not have omniscience of all details. The later position that was formulated got around the omniscience and non-omniscience, kind of combined the two, was that he wasn't omniscient in the sense of holding all knowledge at once at all times, but that he was omniscient in the sense of being able to know anything he turned his mind to. For example, the number of fish in the Ganges River. He wouldn't know that a priori, but if somebody asked him or he had a reason to investigate, he could turn his mind to that and know it immediately. I think this is going far beyond what the Buddha claimed for himself, but it's an example of how the tradition, the commentators, endlessly have to elaborate and spin things. It's human nature, I think. Comical example of that is from the movie Monty Python, Life of Brian. Right? Jesus is giving this sermon on the Mount, and the people at the back of the crowd can't hear what he's saying properly. And one of them says, "What did he say? Well, blessed be the cheesemakers." And then immediately the commentator chimes in. You realize, of course, when he says cheesemakers, he is referring to everyone in the dairy industry. I think in all religions, all traditions, there's always elaboration of the commentators and the very strong urge to cross all the T's and dot all the I's. In terms of the question about the intricacies of karma, this is something that we cannot know because it's so infinitely complex. And it's useful for us to understand the nature of karma and to know the general tendencies and trends. When the Buddha spoke about karma, it was always in a very general way, usually relating to states of rebirth rather than to specific incidents. It would be things like if, like in one sutta, he gives a whole bunch of examples of why someone is born strong and someone is born weak and sickly is because if you help and protect beings in your previous life, then you have a tendency to be reborn strong and healthy. If you harm and damage beings, then you have a tendency to be born sickly. If you're generous and open-handed, you will tend to be born into wealth. If you're mean and stingy, you'll be born into poverty. And so on. There's a list of these kind of trends. And in some of the later stories, like in the Dhammapada and the Jatakas and so on, there occasionally comes up instances of more specific kind of connections. Some of them are quite charming. One of my favorites is King Asoka. In the Buddha's time, King Asoka was a poor child, a street urchin, and the Buddha and Ananda were walking on alms round, and this child was overcome with a faith and a desire to give something. He saw people giving alms to the Buddha, and he was overcome with a desire to give something to the Buddha, but he had nothing to give, so he made a mud pie from dirt from the street and put it in the Buddha's bowl. And this upset Ananda. This little kid's putting muck in your bowl, Lord. Let me get it out. And the Buddha said, "Say not so, Ananda, say not so. That gift of earth shall become the whole of Jambudipa." Meaning that, the Asoka would be the ruler of all India. So this handful of dirt became the whole continent of India. But the story also goes on to say that for his faith and goodness of being moved to give something to the Buddha, he became emperor of India. But because he put something dirty in the Buddha's bowl, he was born with a skin disease. So it's a good example of mixed karma, mixed results. And returning to the question of the infinitude of time, while this is not something that the Buddha specifically taught, he did, in a number of places, teach not the infinitude, but the great vastness of time. And this was, again, an example of the teaching having a practical purpose. There's a reason for the teaching. It wasn't just metaphysical speculation. It was to encourage the listener to give up attachment to samsaric becoming. There's a whole series of short suttas in the Samyutta where he's speaking about the vast number of lifetimes we've all experienced already. The number of skulls we left behind, if they were piled up, they would be higher than the Himalayas. All the mother's breast milk we've drunk, if it could all be collected together, it would be greater than the ocean. One simile after another about the vast number of lifetimes we've lived, and at the end of each one he says, this is not enough. How long will you go on filling the cemeteries? Just pointing out the, what are you doing? You keep coming back again and again. And just leave another skull in the pile. How long are you going to do that for? So there is a specific reason for getting us to think in that way in terms of vastness of time and number of lives, is to encourage that detachment from samsaric becoming, that weariness with rebirth that leads to disenchantment and release. And nibbida viraga nirodha, disenchantment, dispassion, cessation. This is what leads to the mind giving up this passionate attachment to becoming. Likewise, in the sutta where the Buddha speaks about the end of the world, which is, again, is to be understood, it's not the absolute end of everything, it's the end of this world system, destroyed by fire when the sun multiplies 7 times and burns everything up. The explicit purpose of giving this teaching is not just a interesting speculation about the cosmic history. It's to make a point about impermanence by pointing to those features of the environment that individuals perceive as being permanent, like the sun or the sea, and saying, "Oh well, they're not. They're gonna change. Things will happen to them as well." And I think that's, even now, it's still a useful way of contemplating impermanence. Our understanding of the way the physics of the solar system work is quite different, but the underlying point is the same. The sun is not going to last forever. It's going to eventually burn out and destroy all life on Earth. And this is one contemplation of impermanence on a very long time scale, relative to the human life. To encourage in the mind the sense of the universality of impermanence. And impermanence applies even to those things we perceive as being the solid, abiding rocks of existence, like the sun and the mountains and the sea. All these things are constantly changing and eventually will end altogether. So anything that we find in the suttas that the Buddha taught, there's always a specific reason that he wanted to bring this to the attention of his listeners, to encourage the mind to think in certain ways, to help us to overcome our attachments and to lead us onwards into liberation. It's a principle that's not always adhered to in the later texts, but in terms of what the Buddha himself taught, and it's always has a practical purpose of leading us out from suffering into liberation. And it's beginning with the Four Noble Truths, and everything he taught subsequently in his 45 years is always aimed at that goal. And he was a very skillful teacher, and his use of images and metaphors and his sensitivity to the quality of his listeners and what they were ready to hear and what would be useful for them to hear. So one thing this means is that when you are reading suttas, don't be too hasty to skip over the introductory paragraphs that sets the scene, who the Buddha's listeners were and what the context was and what, if any, questions were asked. These are all quite important in understanding the the meaning of the sutta.
Azamayam Dhamma Kataya Sadhu Karam Dharma